The sons of Naboo were beginning their slow descent, spilling golden light across the plains near Theed, when Qui-Gon Jinn fell. Or so it seemed. In the heat of battle with the relentless Darth Maul, his body had been struck, spinning violently across the stone ramparts. For a heartbeat, the galaxy held its breath. Obi-Wan Kenobi had rushed to intervene, his blade clashing against the Sith apprentice with desperation in every strike. And yet, somewhere between instinct and fate, the Master had survived. The Force had whispered, perhaps pleading, and Qui-Gon had responded with the subtle movements of a man who could feel the currents of the universe, even as pain seared through his body. He lay among the ruins, the acrid scent of scorched stone and the metallic tang of blood filling his senses. Around him, the battlefield seemed to shimmer as if time itself were questioning the outcome. Darth Maul's figure receded into the shadows, his twin blades glowing like red streaks of fire against the twilight. Obi-Wan knelt beside his master, eyes wide with shock, the young Padawan's mind struggling to comprehend that Qui-Gon's chest rose with ragged breaths, that the subtle warmth of life pulsed through the veins of the Jedi who should have been gone. Master? Obi-Wan's voice trembled, betraying the strain of the encounter. Qui-Gon turned his gaze slowly, eyes clear, luminous, and full of that unshakable serenity that had always unnerved the Council in the past. Obi-Wan, I am here, he whispered, the strength in his voice defying his battered frame. The words were simple, but the implication was profound. The galaxy had just shifted on its axis, and the consequences were already rippling across countless star systems. Qui-Gon's survival was no mere accident. The living force had guided him in the final moments, a current of energy that had allowed him to sense the deadly strike and twist with impossible precision. His body had taken the brunt of the blow, leaving bruises that would heal over days. But more importantly, the events had granted him clarity. The Force was not passive. It demanded vigilance. And Qui-Gon understood more acutely than ever that the fate of the Republic, the Jedi Order, and perhaps the entire galaxy now rested on choices that had not yet been made. By the time the Jedi Council received word of the Master's unexpected survival, panic and awe mingled in equal measure. On Coruscant, Yoda's ears twitched as he absorbed the news, and Mace Windu's eyes narrowed. Qui-Gon Jinn had been a maverick, a Jedi who had questioned Council orthodoxy and trusted the living Force over dogma. His death, so many had assumed, had been a tragic certainty, a step in the galaxy's narrative that could not be altered. Yet here he was, alive, his survival an anomaly that challenged not only the Council's expectations, but the very flow of destiny as understood by the Jedi. Qui-Gon did not linger in celebration. He had no time for that. The galaxy's threads were tangled in ways he could sense, the undercurrents of destiny pulling towards chaos. He demanded an immediate audience with the Council, not to apologize, but to warn. He walked the familiar corridors of the Jedi Temple, cane in hand, robes slightly singed from his narrow escape. Each step echoed through the halls, carrying with it the weight of someone who had glimpsed the edge of darkness and returned, but not unscarred. The Council chambers were silent as he entered. Yoda's small form tilted forward. The gnarled fingers of Mace Windu tapped impatiently against the desk. Master Qui-Gon, Mace began, his tone clipped, your survival, it is unexpected. Qui-Gon inclined his head, a subtle gesture that carried both humility and gravitas. Yes, he replied softly, unexpected perhaps. But the Force allowed it for a reason. I bring warnings that must be heeded, and guidance that cannot wait. He spoke first of Darth Maul's persistence. The Sith apprentice was no longer a simple assassin sent on a mission of revenge. He was a harbinger of deeper schemes, the apprentice of a dark master whose influence stretched far beyond Naboo. Qui-Gon's insight, sharpened by the living Force, allowed him to sense the subtle manipulations, the hidden alliances, the threats that the Council had yet to perceive. He spoke of Palpatine, not by name at first, but of shadows creeping through the Republic, the corruption that could bloom into something catastrophic if unchecked. The Council listened with a mixture of skepticism and concern. Qui-Gon had always walked a path slightly apart from their rigid protocols. He trusted intuition over codified instruction, and now, he argued, The galaxy itself demanded flexibility, foresight, and the courage to act beyond the letter of the code. The Jedi are meant to serve the living force, not merely the letter of our texts, Qui-Gon said, his gaze sweeping the room. Yet we have clung to dogma, ignoring the signals that the Force has always provided. We must act, and we must guide those whose destinies have not yet been written. Obi-Wan watched silently, absorbing every word. The young Jedi could see the shift in his master, the newfound urgency tempered by a calm he had never witnessed before. Qui-Gon was alive, but more than that, he was enlightened, not by the trauma of survival alone, but by a vision of what the galaxy could become if foresight and courage prevailed over fear and inertia. The immediate concern was Anakin Skywalker. Qui-Gon's attachment to the boy, previously tempered by the knowledge that he would train him at the Council's behest, was now intensified by survival. Anakin is different, he said, voice quiet but firm. He is a prodigy, yes, but the currents around him are volatile. He must be guided carefully, for the consequences of misstep could unravel not just the Republic, but the Jedi themselves. Mace Windu's jaw tightened. You speak of training outside the Council's oversight, he asked, suspicion heavy in his tone. Qui-Gon's answer was simple, almost prophetic. I do not speak of defiance, Master Windu. I speak of adaptation. The galaxy does not bend to our codes. We must bend to it, lest it break in ways we cannot repair. This statement, seemingly innocuous, carried the weight of an impending paradigm shift. Qui-Gon knew that the Clone Wars, the rise of Palpatine, and the eventual fall of the Jedi were all consequences of a chain of events that could be altered if intervention were precise and deliberate. Yet he also understood the perils. One misstep, one act of hubris, could accelerate the very tragedies he sought to prevent. The Council, after hours of debate, granted Qui-Gon a temporary mandate to oversee Anakin's training with greater latitude, allowing him to act in ways that would have previously been forbidden. He immediately set to work, analyzing the boy's potential, observing his temperament, and quietly planting seeds of moral grounding that might steer him away from the dark side. Each lesson, each moment of guidance, was infused with subtle philosophy, pushing Anakin to understand the broader consequences of his power, the weight of choice, and the importance of intuition over mere obedience. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, whispers began to circulate. News of Qui-Gon Jinn's survival traveled through Republic channels, through the Outer Rim, through trade routes, and even into the shadowed corners of criminal syndicates and separatist enclaves. The mere fact of his survival was a signal, interpreted differently by each faction. Some saw hope, others threat. Darth Maul's movements became more erratic, his strikes bolder but less calculated. His connection to a distant Sith master strained by the unforeseen survival of the Jedi who had once bested him. The galaxy itself seemed to respond to Qui-Gon's presence. Star systems shifted subtly, political alliances wavered, and the Force's currents hummed with renewed vitality. Qui-Gon sensed these changes, feeling the pulse of countless worlds and the undertone of destiny vibrating through every decision. His survival was not merely personal. It was a fulcrum upon which countless lives and outcomes now balanced. Obi-Wan, now his companion not just in survival, but in active strategy, began to understand the magnitude of what lay ahead. Qui-Gon would act not as a passive observer, not as a footnote in history, but as a catalyst. Every intervention, every word of guidance, every duel fought with precision and purpose would resonate across time and space. Together, they would navigate treacherous waters, confront moral dilemmas, and challenge the very currents of destiny that seemed set in stone. Qui-Gon Jinn was alive, and in that fact alone, the galaxy trembled, unaware of the monumental changes about to unfold. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. The corridors of the Jedi Temple were quieter than usual, the usual hum of activity dampened by the tension that had spread across Coruscant like a shadow. Qui-Gon Jinn moved with deliberate grace, his cane tapping lightly against the polished floors, echoing through the cavernous hallways. Though physically weakened from his encounter with Darth Maul, the Master's mind was sharper than ever, acutely aware of every whisper, every subtle shift in the currents of the Force. He could sense unease, an undercurrent running through the council, the Padawans, even the city itself. This was more than the aftermath of his survival. It was a stirring of consequences yet to be understood, ripples spreading from a single, pivotal event. Obi-Wan Kenobi followed closely, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. Though he had trained under Qui-Gon for years, he had never seen the Master so attuned, so singularly focused. There was a quiet urgency in his movements, a subtle insistence that action must be taken immediately to prepare for what was to come. The Force, Qui-Gon explained in a low voice as they walked, had always guided those who could listen. But now, more than ever, the signals were insistent, almost frantic, warning of a galaxy teetering on the edge of chaos. Their first stop was the council chambers. Qui-Gon had requested a private audience, knowing that the full implications of his survival and the consequences for the galaxy could not wait. The council's reception was mixed. Some, like Yoda, regarded him with cautious curiosity, while others, like Mace Windu and Cici Tyan, viewed him with thinly veiled suspicion. They understood that Qui-Gon's methods were unorthodox, that he had always walked a line between strict Jedi dogma and the more fluid philosophy of the living Force. Yet his words carried weight, and for once there was a consensus that the urgency could not be ignored. Master Qui-Gon, Yoda began, his small, wizened face furrowed with concern. Survive you did. But since we do, disturbances in the Force. Grave they are, yes, His tone, typically enigmatic, conveyed a rare urgency. Qui-Gon nodded, bowing slightly in acknowledgement. I feel them too, Master Yoda. The threads of fate have shifted, and the galaxy is responding in ways we cannot yet fully comprehend. The events that have yet to come, wars, betrayals, tragedies, are not set in stone. But the risk of inaction has never been greater. Qui-Gon's primary concern, however, was not the abstract currents of the Force alone. It was the concrete, pressing danger posed by Darth Maul and the shadowy figure he served. The Sith apprentice had been dispatched to eliminate him, but in surviving, Qui-Gon realized that the greater threat lay not in Maul alone, but in the orchestrator manipulating the strings from the shadows. He spoke of a presence that the Council could barely sense, a malevolent force spreading quietly through the Republic's veins, shaping politics, commerce, and even the Jedi themselves. Though he did not yet name the figure, his warning was clear. If the Council failed to act decisively, the galaxy would suffer consequences beyond comprehension. Obi-Wan listened, absorbing the weight of Qui-Gon's words. The young Jedi had always respected his master's insight, but this was something else entirely. Qui-Gon's survival had not merely postponed an event. It had altered the trajectory of countless lives, systems, and alliances. The Jedi Order itself, though vast and powerful, was vulnerable to unseen manipulation, and the decisions made in the coming days would ripple outward with unstoppable force. For Obi-Wan, it was both exhilarating and terrifying. He had always believed in destiny, in the careful weaving of the Force. Now he understood that destiny could be guided, but it could also be corrupted if missteps were made. Qui-Gon's plan was immediate and multifaceted. He would begin by establishing stronger connections with key figures in the Republic, observing the Senate closely and identifying those whose motivations were aligned with the greater good. He would meet with Jedi Knights and Masters in secret, forming a network capable of acting decisively where the Council's bureaucracy faltered. And he would guide Anakin Skywalker, not merely as a student, but as a symbol of hope, a living embodiment of the Force's potential to shape the future. The first step was Coruscant's underworld. Qui-Gon understood that the Sith, and those allied to them, often operated through channels unseen by the Republic or the Jedi. Information was power, and Qui-Gon's investigations led him to seek the aid of unlikely sources, smugglers, mercenaries, and former enemies whose own interests aligned temporarily with his. Through discreet channels and careful negotiations, he began to piece together the subtle network of manipulation that had allowed Palpatine, or the shadow he represented, to consolidate influence so quietly. Each revelation brought new urgency. Each connection revealed a deeper layer of complexity. Meanwhile, Obi-Wan focused on the Padawans, ensuring that they were prepared for whatever disruptions might arise. Qui-Gon's philosophy, always centered on the living force, emphasized intuition, adaptability, and moral responsibility over rigid adherence to council mandates. It was a difficult lesson for the young Jedi, many of whom had been trained under stricter, more dogmatic approaches. Yet Obi-Wan's careful mentorship allowed them to see the value of flexibility, the power of perceiving the Force as a living, breathing entity that responded to their actions and choices. The survival of Qui-Gon Jinn also drew attention from factions beyond the Jedi and the Republic. The Trade Federation, already wary of any disruption to their commercial interests, began to shift their strategies in response to subtle movements in the political landscape. Separatist leaders, sensing an unusual strength in the force currents surrounding Coruscant, began to reconsider their timing for large-scale operations. And Darth Maul, driven by a combination of anger and confusion, became increasingly reckless. His connection to his master, previously steady and calculated, faltered as he pursued a Jedi whose survival was not anticipated, a factor that introduced chaos into the plans of the Sith, who relied on precision and long-term strategy. Qui-Gon's interventions were precise but understated. He moved like a shadow across Coruscant, observing, advising, and when necessary, confronting individuals whose actions threatened balance. His survival had given him insight, yes, but also a deep appreciation for restraint. Force power alone could not dictate outcomes. Influence, perception, and timing were equally vital. He became, in many ways, a conductor of the galaxy's currents, guiding events subtly, ensuring that the threads of destiny were nudged toward preservation rather than destruction. At the same time, Qui-Gon's attention remained fixed on Anakin. The boy's training progressed under his guidance, but not without challenges. Qui-Gon emphasized patience, self-control, and awareness of the broader consequences of action. Anakin's raw talent was undeniable, but it came with volatility. Qui-Gon's lessons were not merely physical or academic, they were philosophical, teaching the boy to understand the ripple effects of choices, the subtle interplay of power and responsibility. Each session reinforced the understanding that even the smallest action could have galaxy-altering consequences, a lesson that Qui-Gon himself had learned on Naboo's ramparts. Yet for all his focus, Qui-Gon could feel the dark current stirring. Somewhere in the shadows, the Sith were aware of his survival, and every small success he achieved drew their attention. Assassinations, covert manipulations, and unseen traps began to proliferate, and Qui-Gon realized that a more direct confrontation would eventually be inevitable. The galaxy was entering a period of uncertainty, and the Jedi, while formidable, could not act as if their power alone could shape outcomes. Diplomacy, strategy, and moral clarity were equally essential weapons, and Qui-Gon intended to wield them all. By the end of the first cycle of events, weeks that passed in a blur of observation, instruction, and subtle intervention, Qui-Gon had established several key footholds across Coruscant and the Republic. Allies in politics, discreet informants in the underworld, and a cadre of Jedi attuned to the living force formed a lattice of influence that would serve as the foundation for the coming conflict. Anakin's development progressed, tempered by guidance and foresight, and Qui-Gon sensed a growing resonance between the boy's emerging potential and the currents of the Force that now seemed to respond more dynamically than ever before. And yet, amidst all this preparation, one truth remained constant and inescapable. The galaxy was changing, not just in response to his survival, but because survival itself was a declaration of defiance against the currents of destiny. Qui-Gon Jinn, once thought lost, had returned not merely to fight, but to reshape, to guide, and to confront the hidden threads of power that sought to consume the galaxy. The next moves would determine whether the Republic would thrive, the Jedi would endure, and Anakin Skywalker would rise as a force for balance, or succumb to the shadowed path that loomed ever nearer. Every moment was a choice, every action a potential turning point, and Qui-Gon, alive against all odds, would be the instrument through which the galaxy's fate would pivot. The streets of Coruscant's lower levels hummed with life, a chaotic mosaic of commerce, chatter, and shadow deals. Qui-Gon Jinn descended into this labyrinth with a careful yet purposeful stride, his senses attuned to the pulse of the city from above and below. He had learned that information traveled fastest in the alleys and corridors ignored by the senators and diplomats, and that those overlooked often held keys to the galaxy's deeper currents. Here, the influence of the Sith, though hidden, made its presence felt in subtle ways. Contracts that went unfulfilled, sudden corporate bankruptcies, and whispers of mysterious, deadly visitors. Qui-Gon felt the Force ripple with tension. This was no ordinary day, and no ordinary threat. He moved through the marketplaces with his usual calm, yet Obi-Wan, shadowing him as always, noticed the deliberate scanning of every passerby. The young Jedi had learned to trust Qui-Gon's intuition, but the city's teeming life challenged even the most experienced senses. Qui-Gon's ability to perceive danger was unmatched, yet he knew that raw power alone would not suffice. Survival in the lower levels required discretion, diplomacy, and the ability to read intentions without relying on overt Force manipulation. Even a single misstep could provoke chaos, and Qui-Gon's awareness of the stakes heightened with each step. Their goal was a small information broker named Tauren Voss, a Rodian known for his discretion and connections across multiple factions. The Jedi approached his establishment with quiet caution. Unlike the polished Senate halls or the Jedi Temple's serene corridors, Tauren's office was dimly lit, filled with the scent of machinery, exotic spices, and something fouler that Obi-Wan could not immediately identify. Qui-Gon's hand rested lightly on the hilt of his lightsaber, though it remained concealed beneath his cloak. He preferred negotiation to combat, but his years of experience taught him that readiness was essential. Tauren greeted them with an expression that teetered between suspicion and curiosity. "You're early," he remarked, voice smooth but edged with caution. "And you're not who I expected." Qui-Gon inclined his head. "Information, Tauren. I seek knowledge of movements that threaten the Republic. Your discretion will be rewarded, as always." The Rodian studied him, a flicker of recognition crossing his eyes. Qui-Gon's survival was not widely known, yet certain individuals, especially those with ties to both the underworld and intelligence networks, had already caught wind of the unexpected twist in the galaxy's threads. Voss led them into a room lined with holodisplays, each flickering with streams of data from multiple systems. "The Separatists are restless," he began, tapping a few commands. "But it's not just them. There's someone or something interfering with the Republic's operations in ways we can't yet trace. Contracts are being sabotaged, logistics rerouted. Certain senators are receiving directives from unknown sources. And the Sith, they're acting more cautiously, like they're aware of someone watching, someone who isn't bound by usual expectations." His words made Obi-Wan uneasy. Qui-Gon, however, nodded in understanding. The subtle, pervasive influence of the Force often revealed what the physical world could not. Qui-Gon's mind worked rapidly, connecting threads of seemingly unrelated events. The survival of one Jedi had already shifted balance. The Force itself appeared to be responding to his presence, realigning currents that had once seemed fixed. He felt a disturbance emanating from the core of the Trade Federation's operations, from the cloaked shadows of the underworld syndicates, and from distant systems where separatist generals prepared for war. Each pulse of tension represented a decision point, a node where the galaxy could tip toward stability or chaos. And all of it traced back in subtle ways to Qui-Gon Jinn's continued existence. Meanwhile, Obi-Wan observed the Jedi Master's approach to leverage. Qui-Gon did not rely solely on his abilities in the Force. He read motives, predicted behaviors, and anticipated reactions in a way that transcended simple precognition. His methods were subtle. A question posed at the right moment, a hand on a shoulder, an offer made in passing. These were small interventions, yet the implications could ripple across systems, shifting allegiances and destabilizing plots. Qui-Gon's understanding of the galaxy as a network of choices rather than a predetermined path was something even the Council rarely grasped fully. It was this perspective that had allowed him to survive Maul, and more importantly, to begin shaping the galaxy in ways few others could. Their meeting with Tauren yielded critical intelligence. Certain senators, manipulated by unknown operatives, were moving to approve policies that could undermine the Republic's logistical cohesion. Star systems, once considered neutral, were subtly aligning with separatist sympathizers. And troublingly, whispers of Sith influence in unexpected quarters suggested that the Emperor's apprentice, or another dark agent, was attempting to anticipate Jedi strategies in ways previously unthinkable. Qui-Gon recognized the signature immediately, calculated disruption with the intent to provoke overreaction. The galaxy was being maneuvered like pieces on a game board, but the player remained elusive. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan departed Tauren's office with a renewed sense of purpose. The force around them was taut, alive with the possibilities and dangers of multiple futures converging. Qui-Gon's mind turned immediately to Anakin Skywalker. If the boy was to play the role the Force intended, he would need guidance beyond traditional Jedi instruction. Qui-Gon's survival had afforded him a unique position to influence the boy's development in ways that the Order could not yet imagine. It was not merely about training for lightsaber combat or piloting skills. It was about moral clarity, foresight, and the wisdom to act when destiny itself demanded judgment. Returning to the Jedi Temple, Qui-Gon convened a discreet session with key allies. He had chosen Jedi who shared his philosophy of the living force, individuals who valued intuition, balance, and adaptability over rigid dogma. The discussions were intense and far-reaching. Qui-Gon emphasized the importance of observation, preparation, and the cultivation of personal agency within the Order. The galaxy, he told them, is not fixed. Events ripple outward from choices, from courage, from inaction. We must act, not because we can see every outcome, but because inaction has consequences far greater than action. We shape destiny, not simply follow it. His words resonated, yet also sparked debate. Some masters worried that such intervention might breach the Jedi Code, while others recognized that extraordinary circumstances demanded extraordinary measures. The strategy Qui-Gon outlined was multifaceted. First, intelligence operations would be expanded, utilizing both Jedi and select, trustworthy contacts within the underworld. Second, diplomatic outreach would be intensified, with subtle guidance offered to senators and planetary governors to ensure stability. Third, Anakin's training would be accelerated, but with a focus on restraint, awareness, and the understanding of moral complexity, qualities that could counteract the boy's natural impulsiveness. And finally, contingency plans were prepared to counter any unforeseen moves by the Sith or their agents, ensuring that the Jedi could act decisively without waiting for formal council mandates. Meanwhile, Qui-Gon's own personal journey continued. The survival that had once seemed miraculous became a source of profound reflection. He understood, more than ever, that the Force was not merely a tool or a weapon. It was an active participant in the galaxy's unfolding narrative. His connection to it had deepened, attuned not only to danger and opportunity, but to the very ebb and flow of sentient life. Each encounter, each decision, became a conversation with destiny itself. And as he moved through Coruscant, through hidden corridors and bustling marketplaces, he sensed that the galaxy was both more fragile and more resilient than he had ever imagined. As the days passed, subtle shifts began to manifest across multiple arenas. Senators reconsidered their votes, trade routes subtly altered, intelligence leaks disrupted enemy operations. Even Darth Maul, increasingly frustrated by unforeseen setbacks, exhibited unusual caution in his movements. The Force, responding to Qui-Gon's survival and deliberate interventions, had begun to realign events in ways that few could anticipate. It was as if a new variable, an agent both powerful and unpredictable, had entered the galaxy's calculations, forcing everyone, Jedi and Sith alike, to reconsider strategy and expectation. For Obi-Wan, observing these developments provided both education and anxiety. He had always respected Qui-Gon's unconventional methods, but seeing them in practice at this scale revealed the breadth of the Master's vision. The Force was a living web, and Qui-Gon's understanding allowed him to manipulate its threads subtly, guiding events toward balance without imposing overt control. It was a dangerous game, and one misstep could invite disaster. Yet the precision, clarity, and moral grounding of Qui-Gon's actions demonstrated that survival had not merely preserved life. It had preserved the capacity to influence destiny itself. The culmination of these early efforts would soon become evident in subtle but significant ways. Systems that had been on the brink of aligning with separatist sympathizers shifted loyalties. Intelligence leaks revealed hidden plots, and Anakin, guided by Qui-Gon's insight, began demonstrating discernment and focus far beyond his years. The galaxy, once teetering on the edge of predictable chaos, now pulsed with uncertainty, a force reshaped by the survival and intervention of a single Jedi whose presence had altered the fundamental flow of events. Yet even as progress unfolded, Qui-Gon remained acutely aware of the looming threat. The Sith were patient, methodical, and ruthless. Every success in intelligence gathering or political maneuvering could trigger retaliation, and the galaxy's response was never predictable. Qui-Gon knew that the coming weeks would demand both wisdom and courage, and that the choices made now would echo across the stars for generations to come. The survival of Qui-Gon Jinn was not merely a twist of fate, it was a catalyst, a fulcrum on which the galaxy's balance rested precariously. The sun dipped behind Coruscant's upper spires, casting the lower levels into shadow. The endless hum of the city gave way to the more subtle noises of machinery, distant engines, and muffled conversations. Qui-Gon Jinn moved through these levels with the calm intensity of a predator, attuned to every vibration of his surroundings. Obi-Wan, ever vigilant, kept pace, eyes scanning every alleyway, every shadowed corner. For them, Coruscant was no longer just the political heart of a republic. It had become a living chessboard, and each step carried unseen consequences. Qui-Gon's survival, though secret, had created waves that touched even the most remote corners of the city, rippling outward like concentric circles in a darkened pool. Their mission this evening was delicate. Qui-Gon had learned through Tauren Voss that a clandestine auction was being held in the lower levels, a gathering of criminal syndicates, separatist sympathizers, and a few rogue Imperial agents who had somehow survived in hiding. The auction was rumored to hold intelligence that could reshape supply lines across multiple star systems, a treasure trove of information that could either stabilize or destabilize entire regions of the galaxy. Qui-Gon understood that access required subtlety. The Force could reveal intent, but it could not prevent the consequences of exposure. In a galaxy full of spies, any overt action would attract deadly attention. The marketplace that served as the entry point for the auction was a maze of vendors, droid repair stalls, and shadowed corners, where illicit deals occurred beneath the noses of Republic authorities. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan approached with care, cloaks drawn, eyes shifting beneath hoods. Qui-Gon's senses were finely attuned to disturbances in the Force, and the tension around them was thick, almost tactile. There was a presence, dark and deliberate, that moved among the crowd like a predator, yet it remained elusive. Qui-Gon could sense its intent, the careful calculation, the awareness of his own survival. Whoever, or whatever, was here, it knew of him. That realization sent a ripple of urgency through his veins. Obi-Wan whispered, "Master, are you certain this is safe?" Qui-Gon's reply was calm, but measured. "Safe is relative, Obi-Wan. We operate in the margins between danger and discovery. Our presence alone changes the calculus. The Force will guide, but it will not shield us from consequences entirely." Obi-Wan nodded, understanding that survival was not guaranteed by ability alone, but by foresight and the subtle orchestration of events. Qui-Gon's approach was never about confrontation unless necessary. It was about controlling outcomes, steering possibilities toward balance, and using perception as a weapon. The auction itself was held in an enormous subterranean chamber, a cavernous space lit by flickering hollow projectors and occasional bursts of neon. Hollow screens displayed commodities, ranging from rare minerals to stolen starship blueprints, while the whispers of deals and bartering filled the air. The participants were a mix of species, some familiar, others exotic even to Coruscant's cosmopolitan norms. Qui-Gon's focus, however, was not on the merchandise, it was on the interactions, the hidden contracts, and the subtle hierarchies. In the Force, each participant radiated intent. Each choice, each hesitation, told a story of ambition, fear, and greed. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan made their way to the auction floor under the guise of interested buyers. Qui-Gon's calm demeanor allowed him to blend, yet every instinct remained alert. He noted a group of Trandashans conversing in hisses, their hands never far from concealed blasters. Across the room, a Radian smiled too widely, calculating risks, while holding the attention of a Zabrak with distinctive facial tattoos, potentially a former Separatist operative. And in the shadows, a cloaked figure observed the room, posture rigid, aura darkened with an energy Qui-Gon recognized all too well. The Sith, or a disciple thereof, was nearby, and they had come prepared. Qui-Gon's mind raced as he considered the ramifications. The survival of one Jedi had already destabilized the Sith's calculations, but this was no ordinary encounter. Here, in the lower levels, the Dark Agent had the advantage of terrain, knowledge, and anticipation of the Republic's blind spots. Qui-Gon's challenge was to engage without revealing his full capabilities, to anticipate the opponent's moves while protecting vital intelligence. Obi-Wan, sensing the tension, adjusted his stance, ready to act should violence erupt. Qui-Gon's approach, however, was deliberate. He would not strike first. He would let the Force guide him toward the most advantageous intervention. The auctioneer, a sleek, multi-limbed alien, began to present the first item, a shipment of rare hyperfuel cores destined for a Separatist stronghold. Qui-Gon observed the bidding war with detached interest, noting patterns in behavior, the subtle negotiations that reflected larger alliances. It was here that the interconnectedness of the galaxy became painfully clear. What happened in a hidden chamber beneath Coruscant could affect battles in distant star systems, tipping scales of power in ways most would never comprehend. The Force whispered possibilities and consequences, each outcome branching into dozens of potential futures. As the bidding escalated, Qui-Gon sensed movement, a subtle shift, the presence of the cloaked dark figure drawing closer. The figure was calculating, precise, aware of Qui-Gon's survival. The Jedi Master's instincts flared. He felt the rhythm of the Force tighten around him, a living pulse that demanded action. The choice was immediate. Intervene directly, potentially revealing himself, or manipulate events subtly to force the Dark Agent into a disadvantageous position. Qui-Gon chose the latter, a signature approach that relied on perception, timing, and the ethical use of power. He subtly adjusted the attention of the room, nudging certain bidders into distraction while signaling Obi-Wan to create minor diversions. A careful arrangement of gestures, whispered words, and focused intent allowed him to steer the Dark Agent into engaging with a rival group unwittingly. The Force flowed around him, a network of awareness that amplified his influence without overtly breaking cover. By the time the Dark Agent realized the maneuver, their position was compromised. They were forced to retreat into shadows, unseen but thwarted. Qui-Gon's calculated intervention had preserved the integrity of intelligence and prevented unnecessary bloodshed. Yet the episode served as a reminder. The galaxy was volatile, and every decision carried consequences. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan departed the auction with critical intelligence, insights into Separatist maneuvers, and confirmation that the Sith's reach was expanding in ways previously undetected. Their return to the temple was quiet, contemplative, and laden with reflection. Qui-Gon understood that the survival that had once seemed miraculous was now a burden and a responsibility. Each action he took altered not only immediate outcomes, but the very trajectory of the galaxy's future. Once back at the temple, Qui-Gon initiated a secure debriefing with select Jedi who shared his philosophy. Discussions focused on interpreting intelligence, predicting factional responses, and anticipating Sith strategies. Qui-Gon emphasized adaptability. We cannot rely solely on foresight or dogma. The galaxy is living, breathing, and unpredictable. Every choice we make must account for multiple potential outcomes, and yet we must act decisively when clarity emerges. The Jedi present absorbed the lesson, recognizing that Qui-Gon's survival was more than personal. It had become a pivot point for the Order's approach to strategy, philosophy, and intervention. Meanwhile, Anakin Skywalker's training continued under Qui-Gon's direct guidance. The boy's prodigious talent was undeniable, but now, under the watchful eyes of the Master who had survived Maul's attack, lessons extended beyond combat. Qui-Gon emphasized moral discernment, awareness of consequence, and the courage to act in ambiguity. Anakin's natural impulsiveness was tempered by reflective practice, guided by meditation, ethical debate, and controlled exposure to moral dilemmas that mirrored the complex realities of galactic politics. The boy's development was no longer a theoretical exercise. It was a deliberate shaping of the Force-sensitive agent who might one day tip the balance between light and dark. The galaxy itself became a participant in the unfolding narrative. Qui-Gon's survival shifted equilibrium subtly but profoundly. Separatist generals hesitated in their strategies, sensing unforeseen pressure from unseen forces. Senate deliberations were influenced by quiet interventions, unseen yet effective. Sith operatives, aware that their plans were being countered in unpredictable ways, acted with caution, miscalculating the influence of one Jedi who had defied death. The galaxy, in effect, had become a stage upon which Qui-Gon Jinn's choices reverberated, altering outcomes that no prophecy had fully anticipated. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan had not only gathered critical intelligence, but also demonstrated the potential of a Jedi who survived beyond what destiny or convention had dictated. The Force, as always, remained impartial, yet it responded to the presence of those who could act with insight, courage, and ethical discernment. Qui-Gon's survival was no longer an anomaly. It was a vector through which the galaxy's future could be actively guided, a beacon that illuminated paths unseen and possibilities previously unimagined. The corridors of the Jedi Temple were quiet now, a deceptive calm after the tense maneuvers in the lower levels of Coruscant. Qui-Gon Jinn moved with his customary poise, though the weight of his survival pressed heavily upon him. Obi-Wan followed closely, the Padawan's gait measured but alert. The boy's mind was a storm of questions and uncertainty. For both of them, the galaxy had shifted in ways subtle but irrevocable. Qui-Gon's survival from Darth Maul's ambush during the Naboo conflict had not only altered personal fates, it had introduced a ripple effect that stretched across political, military, and mystical landscapes. Qui-Gon had spent long hours reviewing intelligence from the underground auction. His mind balanced strategy, foresight, and morality in equal measure. He understood that the galaxy was a complex web of interdependent systems. Ships, star systems, factions, and Force-sensitive individuals were nodes in this web, and the slightest adjustment at one point could propagate consequences that no one could fully predict. The data from the auction, particularly regarding separatist logistics and secret alliances, demanded action. Yet Qui-Gon was mindful that overt interference could provoke catastrophic outcomes. Exposing Jedi involvement might catalyze early conflict escalation or draw Sith attention prematurely. Obi-Wan's voice broke the quiet, tentative but insistent. Master, the intelligence, it suggests a direct threat to the Senate itself. Some of these shipments could supply agents within Coruscant. Are we prepared for a response? Qui-Gon's eyes narrowed, not in impatience, but in the contemplative manner of someone weighing the infinite variables of consequence. Preparedness alone is insufficient, Obi-Wan. The Force guides those who act with discernment. It does not guarantee victory or safety. Our role is to anticipate, to influence, and to act with clarity when a window opens. Reacting hastily would be a failure of judgment. The plan Qui-Gon devised was multi-layered. First, he and Obi-Wan would discreetly trace the origins of the auction items, establishing contacts with intermediaries in the galactic underworld who could provide early warnings of separatist maneuvers. Second, they would approach sympathetic senators and Republic agents, subtly redirecting their attention toward vulnerabilities exposed by the auction. Finally, Qui-Gon intended to engage in limited but decisive confrontations with known agents of the dark side, testing their capabilities, gauging strategic intent, and establishing early deterrence without openly provoking retaliation. Their first mission took them to the sprawl of Coruscant's mid-level sectors, a labyrinth of industrial complexes, transport hubs, and crime syndicates. Qui-Gon's senses guided him through the thrumming energy of the city, each vibration of the Force revealing undercurrents of tension, greed, and fear. The first contact was a representative of Black Sun, a syndicate whose interests intersected both legal and illicit commerce. Qui-Gon had no illusions about negotiating with such entities. Influence required leverage, respect, and the subtle demonstration of competence. Through the Force, he discerned motivations: avarice tempered by self-preservation, ambition restrained by pragmatism. A carefully placed warning, a suggestion of risk, and a subtle display of power were sufficient to steer the syndicate toward cooperation without overt coercion. Obi-Wan, meanwhile, observed the subtler details. The behavior of individuals, the unspoken communication between factions, and the careful placement of resources all offered insight into the operational networks of the underworld. For the Padawan, it was a practical lesson in diplomacy and strategy. Qui-Gon's approach was never about brute force. It was about understanding, anticipation, and the ethical use of influence. In this, the young Jedi began to comprehend the complexity of navigating a galaxy where morality was often relative, and the line between ally and adversary could blur in a heartbeat. As their investigations continued, Qui-Gon became increasingly aware of a more insidious threat: the Shadow Hand, a covert cell of Sith loyalists operating under the guise of neutral traders and bureaucrats. These agents were meticulous, patient, and ruthless, unseen but effective in their manipulations. Qui-Gon's survival had already disturbed the Sith's calculations. The presence of a Jedi thought dead challenged assumptions, disrupted hierarchies, and forced the Order to recalibrate strategies. This cell represented an escalation. They were aware of the anomaly and sought to exploit it, either by luring Qui-Gon into a confrontation or by destabilizing key systems to provoke wider conflict. Qui-Gon's response was measured. Direct confrontation would be reckless. Instead, he used the Force to create subtle misdirection, influencing communications, redirecting resources, and establishing surveillance through intermediaries. Obi-Wan, tasked with observation and tactical support, executed these measures with growing competence, learning the balance between action and patience. Qui-Gon emphasized the ethical dimension. Power without restraint, even against darkness, could erode principles and inadvertently empower the enemy. Every step was deliberate. Every choice weighed against immediate and long-term consequences. The first engagement with the Shadow Hand occurred in a hidden docking facility. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan had tracked a shipment containing weaponized droid components, an early warning sign of potential conflict escalation. They arrived under cover of darkness, navigating through crates, hover platforms, and patrolling security droids. The Force guided their movements. Qui-Gon could sense the subtle shifts of intention, detecting each agent's awareness and calculating their reactions. Unlike past confrontations, this was a test of anticipation and precision. The goal was not annihilation, but neutralization and intelligence gathering. The operation unfolded with meticulous coordination. Qui-Gon disabled surveillance arrays with a combination of precise telekinetic manipulation and low-level Force persuasion, causing guards to overlook anomalies as minor malfunctions. Obi-Wan's lightsaber remained sheathed, drawn only as necessary to deflect a sudden strike from a security droid malfunctioning under Qui-Gon's influence. They secured the shipment, intercepted communications, and left undetected, leaving behind the impression of routine industrial activity. In the Force, Qui-Gon noted the subtle reactions of the Shadow Hand agents, who sensed interference but could not immediately identify its source. The lesson was clear. Subtlety and intelligence often outweighed overt power, a principle he emphasized to Obi-Wan in debriefing later. Back at the temple, Qui-Gon reflected on these operations with a clarity tempered by contemplation. His survival had become a catalyst not only for immediate tactical advantage, but for philosophical exploration. The galaxy's future was now contingent upon choices he had not originally anticipated, and the interplay of morality, strategy, and consequence demanded ongoing vigilance. Anakin Skywalker's training was informed by these lessons. The boy was exposed to ethical dilemmas, operational planning, and the responsibility of foresight. Qui-Gon emphasized that strength alone, even immense, could not determine outcomes without wisdom guiding its application. Beyond immediate tactical concerns, Qui-Gon also began exploring the broader metaphysical implications of his continued existence. Survival had altered not only personal fate, but the current of the Force itself. He sensed emerging currents of possibility that had not existed in his original timeline. Paths where the Republic could endure longer, where Sith ambitions might be constrained, and where Anakin's choices could be tempered by mentorship that now had time to unfold. Yet alongside these possibilities lay potential catastrophes, scenarios where premature intervention could provoke unforeseen conflict, destabilize entire systems, or accelerate the rise of darkness in unanticipated ways. Every action was both opportunity and risk, and Qui-Gon accepted this duality as the responsibility of a Jedi attuned to the living Force. As the days progressed, Qui-Gon's influence expanded in subtle yet profound ways. Political decisions in the Senate were affected by intelligence he had discreetly supplied. Separatist movements were disrupted through precise intervention, and hidden Sith agents hesitated, uncertain of the extent of the Jedi's capabilities. Each ripple reinforced a central truth. The galaxy's equilibrium was a delicate balance, responsive to perception, insight, and the judicious application of power. Qui-Gon's survival was no longer an anomaly. It was a lever upon which countless fates now depended. Amid these developments, Qui-Gon maintained personal reflection. The specter of mortality, which had haunted him in his first encounter with Darth Maul, remained a point of contemplation. Survival had offered opportunity, but also responsibility. The ethical dimension of influencing events, particularly through subtle Force manipulation and strategic foresight, weighed upon him. Each intervention was an exercise in restraint, discernment, and moral judgment, a constant negotiation between principle and necessity. The Jedi's purpose, as Qui-Gon understood it now, extended beyond protection or combat. It was stewardship of balance, insight, and the cultivation of possibilities aligned with harmony rather than domination. Obi-Wan observed these lessons with quiet intensity. The Padawan's understanding of the Force deepened, shaped by the lived experience of strategic intervention, ethical decision-making, and the subtle art of influence. Training sessions became more than combat drills. They incorporated simulations of political maneuvering, moral decision trees, and predictive analysis of factional dynamics. Qui-Gon's teaching emphasized foresight and perception over direct confrontation, challenging traditional notions of Jedi engagement while preparing his students for a galaxy now altered by circumstance. Qui-Gon sensed a growing tension emanating from the unknown regions, an energy disturbance that radiated both darkness and calculated intent. The Shadow Hand, though disrupted, was reorganizing, and their agents in the higher levels of Coruscant were likely preparing contingencies. Meanwhile, the Separatists continued their operations in remote sectors, unaware that their logistical frameworks were being subtly undermined. Qui-Gon's survival was now the axis upon which future conflicts would pivot, and he accepted that the galaxy had entered a period of unprecedented uncertainty, a time when foresight, subtlety, and moral clarity would determine the balance of power. The Republic Senate, normally a stage of endless debate and procedural tedium, had taken on a new energy, subtle but undeniable. Qui-Gon Jinn's survival had introduced a variable the galaxy could not yet quantify. Senators whispered of Jedi movements with unusual interest. Advisors consulted holocrons and intelligence briefings more rigorously. The ripple effect of a single Jedi's survival, previously dismissed as an anecdote of heroism, now threaded through every political corridor. Qui-Gon understood that influence was as much about perception as power, and he intended to use this to redirect the galaxy toward stability without overtly controlling it. The Force was his guide, but subtlety would be his instrument. Qui-Gon entered the Senate chambers under the guise of a routine consultation with Chancellor Valorum. Yet every step, every gesture, every word was calculated to shift perception. Senators who previously ignored Jedi advice now listened with heightened attention. The Jedi's role had been historically defined by enforcement and moral counsel. Now, Qui-Gon sought to expand it to foresight and mediation. The galaxy, he said quietly in the Chancellor's private office, is at a crossroads. Knowledge alone will not prevent disaster. Strategic action, guided by principle, must shape outcomes before chaos finds its way. Valorum, sensing the urgency, nodded with quiet apprehension, aware that Qui-Gon's presence signified more than a routine briefing. The first major political maneuver involved the Neutral Systems Coalition, a network of mid-tier star systems whose allegiance was fluid and whose trade networks were critical to Republic stability. Qui-Gon identified them not through coercion, but through understanding. Their motivations, fears, and ambitions resonated in the Force as currents waiting to be guided. Through discreet diplomacy, subtle intelligence sharing, and the occasional demonstration of Force-influenced insight, Qui-Gon steered these systems toward a posture favorable to the Republic without their conscious recognition. It was a masterclass in influence. The Jedi's power was felt not in intimidation, but in subtle orchestration, an unseen hand guiding events toward equilibrium. Meanwhile, the Shadow Hand continued its clandestine operations. The Sith loyalists had grown more cautious, aware that their previous assumptions about Qui-Gon's demise were false. Through encrypted communications and indirect observation, they tested his limits, probing for weaknesses in technique, strategy, and ethical resolve. Qui-Gon recognized the signs immediately: small, deliberate disturbances in trade routes, unexpected sabotage of diplomatic negotiations, and the presence of subtle dark energy in regions previously considered stable. These agents were both patient and ruthless, leveraging time and uncertainty as weapons. Qui-Gon's counter-strategy required both patience and adaptability, a balance of defensive foresight and selective engagement. The next confrontation occurred on Ord Mantell, where a shipment of illegal armaments, intended for Separatist sympathizers, had been rerouted through a hidden network of planetary smugglers. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan tracked the route through a combination of Force sensitivity and traditional intelligence work. Their arrival was calculated to intercept the shipment without triggering alarm or escalating violence. Qui-Gon used precise Force manipulation to misdirect patrol droids, subtly influence guards' attention, and create illusions of environmental hazards. Obi-Wan's role was vital, covering flanks, observing potential threats, and ensuring that the moral parameters of engagement were strictly adhered to. The engagement itself was a study in controlled precision. Qui-Gon disarmed multiple adversaries without lethal force, neutralized energy fields, and manipulated environmental elements to prevent harm to non-combatants. The shipment was secured, and the individuals involved were redirected through diplomatic channels to legal mediation processes, a precedent-setting move that emphasized accountability without cruelty. The Shadow Hand's agents, observing from a distance, were left confounded. The Jedi's tactics were effective, non-lethal, and strategically sophisticated. In this moment, Qui-Gon's philosophy crystallized. Survival, influence, and moral clarity were inseparable components of effective Jedi action. Back on Coruscant, the political implications were immense. Qui-Gon's intervention had demonstrated that Jedi could operate beyond traditional combat roles, influencing not only military outcomes, but political stability. This was particularly significant in the context of the Senate's ongoing debates over increased militarization in response to separatist activity. Senators began to consider options beyond simple fleet expansion. Intelligence networks, strategic alliances, and ethical oversight became central themes. Qui-Gon's presence had shifted the discourse from reactionary defense to proactive stabilization, a subtle but profound recalibration of the Republic's strategic posture. Qui-Gon's mentorship of Obi-Wan also intensified during this period. The Padawan was exposed to the nuanced art of political foresight, ethical calculation, and adaptive strategy. Qui-Gon emphasized that power without wisdom was dangerous. Influence without principle was destructive. Obi-Wan absorbed these lessons, learning to anticipate outcomes, interpret motivations, and act with measured restraint. Training sessions included simulations of hypothetical crises, ethical dilemmas, and rapid decision scenarios. Qui-Gon challenged his Padawan to consider multiple potential outcomes simultaneously, fostering a mindset attuned to both immediate and long-term consequences. The Force, as Qui-Gon taught, was not merely a tool for combat, but a lens for understanding causality and moral responsibility. Amid these developments, Qui-Gon's awareness of Anakin Skywalker deepened. The boy's potential was immense, yet fragile, susceptible to both light and darkness. Qui-Gon's extended mentorship allowed him to shape the young Jedi's development more deliberately, balancing combat training with philosophical discourse, ethical inquiry, and strategic reasoning. The survival of Qui-Gon created a timeline where Anakin's impulsiveness could be tempered through dialogue, guided exposure to diverse scenarios, and careful cultivation of moral and practical judgment. Qui-Gon understood that this mentorship could alter the trajectory of the galaxy itself, potentially averting tragedies that would otherwise unfold under the original timeline. The Shadow Hand, meanwhile, escalated their maneuvers. Sith-aligned agents infiltrated critical nodes of trade, communication, and intelligence, attempting to destabilize Republic operations and test Qui-Gon's strategic responses. These incursions were met with calculated countermeasures. Misinformation campaigns, subtle Force-guided interventions, and targeted exposure of agents' identities to sympathetic intermediaries. Qui-Gon's approach was consistently non-lethal, yet highly effective, emphasizing disruption, intelligence gathering, and containment over outright annihilation. Each engagement refined his understanding of the dark side's subtle mechanics, its influence over perception, ambition, and fear, and enhanced his ability to anticipate threats before they materialized fully. The metaphysical dimension of Qui-Gon's survival also manifested in unexpected ways. The Force itself seemed to bend subtly around his extended presence, creating pathways of potentiality that had not existed previously. Qui-Gon sensed emerging lines of possibility, moments where strategic insight could prevent conflict escalation, choices that could stabilize volatile systems, and interventions that could preserve balance in regions teetering toward chaos. The galaxy, in essence, was responding to his survival, adjusting its currents in ways that reflected both opportunity and responsibility. Qui-Gon recognized that this influence required careful calibration. Even a minor misstep could magnify unpredictably, producing consequences that no foresight could fully anticipate. As weeks turned to months, Qui-Gon's dual role, mentor and operative, expanded across multiple domains. Political systems, trade networks, and intelligence frameworks were subtly optimized under his guidance. The Jedi Order itself began to reflect a broader scope of engagement, considering strategic foresight, ethical influence, and preemptive stabilization as integral to their mission. Qui-Gon's survival had created not just tactical advantages, but philosophical evolution, challenging rigid interpretations of Jedi duty and redefining the interplay between morality, influence, and power. The Shadow Hand's reach extended into uncharted regions, their strategy increasingly audacious and complex. Qui-Gon sensed both danger and opportunity, a duality that defined his survival strategy. The galaxy had entered a period of unprecedented flux. Potentialities were expanding, outcomes were mutable, and the decisions of one Jedi could cascade across star systems, affecting politics, war, and morality alike. Qui-Gon understood that the next series of engagements would not be measured solely in victories or defeats, but in the careful orchestration of influence, foresight, and ethical judgment, the hallmarks of a Jedi whose survival had changed everything. The galaxy was shifting in ways both visible and subtle. Qui-Gon Jinn's survival had already left its imprint on Coruscant's corridors of power, yet the true test of influence was always measured beyond the Senate, in the systems where ordinary lives intertwined with politics, war, and fear. Qui-Gon understood this. The Force did not operate in isolation. It threaded through infrastructure, commerce, loyalty, and ambition. To wield influence responsibly, he needed to act where consequences were immediate, tangible, and irreversible. It was a lesson in humility and precision, one that would define his next series of maneuvers. Qui-Gon's attention turned to the Outer Rim, where separatist sympathizers and criminal syndicates frequently undermined Republic stability. Ord Mantell had been a test, a controlled demonstration of intervention without lethal force. Now the scope broadened. Qui-Gon coordinated with select Jedi operatives, not to command, but to advise, ensuring that interventions reflected balance rather than domination. Strategic disruptions, supply lines rerouted, misinformation campaigns, non-lethal neutralizations of hostile forces became the new standard. Obi-Wan, increasingly confident, executed these operations under Qui-Gon's guidance, blending tactical acumen with moral reasoning. The dynamic was symbiotic, mentor and apprentice learning, adjusting, and adapting together, each feeding the other's understanding of subtle influence. The Shadow Hand, ever watchful, escalated their activities. Sith-aligned agents began to infiltrate planetary governments, trade guilds, and intelligence networks, testing Qui-Gon's ability to respond without exposing the Jedi's hand. Qui-Gon anticipated these incursions using Force-sensitive foresight, yet he recognized the danger in over-reliance. Foreknowledge was not control. It was a tool to guide action. He instructed Jedi teams to maintain autonomy, encouraging critical thinking and flexibility. Each engagement became a lesson in decision-making under pressure, blending Jedi philosophy with practical outcomes. This decentralized approach frustrated the Shadow Hand, whose expectation of a singular, predictable target was repeatedly subverted. The next major crisis arose on the planet Ryloth, whose population had long been caught in the tension between Republic protection and local insurgency. Qui-Gon had identified early warning signs, trade disruptions, rumors of mercenary recruitment, and subtle dark side interference influencing public perception. Arrival required finesse. A fleet could have enforced compliance, but Qui-Gon's approach emphasized minimal force and maximum subtlety. Utilizing force-guided negotiation, he influenced key council members' perceptions, subtly nudged local leaders toward consensus, and provided the Twi'lek community with tools to defend themselves without escalating violence. Simultaneously, Obi-Wan handled tactical contingencies, neutralizing small-scale sabotage while ensuring that no lethal force endangered innocents. The Jedi presence was felt as a stabilizing force, yet it never imposed itself overtly, a delicate balance between guidance and respect for autonomy. Amid these operations, Qui-Gon's mentorship of Anakin Skywalker deepened. The boy's potential had always been immense, yet now the focus shifted toward proactive cultivation. Qui-Gon orchestrated scenarios where Anakin's impulsiveness could be harnessed constructively, exposing him to ethical dilemmas that required forethought, negotiation, and the balancing of consequence. Simulations included complex trade negotiations, hostage crises, and moral quandaries where the distinction between victory and ethical compromise was blurred. Anakin learned to anticipate outcomes beyond immediate results, recognizing the weight of responsibility that accompanied extraordinary power. Qui-Gon's guidance emphasized restraint not as limitation, but as a force multiplier, channeling raw potential into measured, transformative action. However, the Shadow Hand did not relent. Sith agents orchestrated a multidimensional crisis, coordinating political destabilization, trade sabotage, and assassination attempts across multiple systems. Their strategy relied on diffusion, fragmenting Jedi focus, inducing moral compromise, and exploiting temporal gaps in intelligence flow. Qui-Gon, sensing the magnitude, realized that conventional response alone would be insufficient. Instead, he employed a layered strategy. Intelligence networks to anticipate moves, force-sensitive insights to predict behavioral patterns, and carefully calibrated interventions to neutralize threats without leaving visible traces. These operations demanded both moral precision and tactical ingenuity. The galaxy's balance depended not on brute force, but on careful orchestration. One particularly tense encounter occurred in the Thrantis system, where a mercenary consortium had aligned with Sith sympathizers to seize critical trade routes. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan engaged the consortium's leaders, not with blasters or lightsabers at first, but through negotiation, intimidation, and subtle force influence. Qui-Gon projected an aura of inevitability, guiding decisions without directly controlling will. Some leaders acquiesced, others resisted, testing the Jedi's patience and strategic foresight. In those instances, Obi-Wan executed targeted, non-lethal interventions, disarming threats and creating an environment where compliant action became the most logical choice. The Force was leveraged not as a weapon, but as an invisible channel of influence, reshaping outcomes without overt domination. Even Sith observers were forced to reconsider assumptions. Qui-Gon's approach challenged traditional paradigms of power and engagement. Political ramifications on Coruscant were equally significant. Senators who had previously dismissed Jedi influence began to recognize the tangible benefits of Qui-Gon's actions. Factions within the Senate debated the role of Jedi in proactive stability operations. Some argued that empowering Jedi beyond advisory roles risked undermining democratic process, while others recognized the necessity of foresight-driven interventions to prevent widespread systemic collapse. Qui-Gon, ever mindful of perception, maintained a low profile while subtly nudging legislative discussions toward reform, transparency, and preventative measures. The Force guided him in recognizing opportunities to shape outcomes subtly, emphasizing persuasion over coercion, insight over decree. Throughout this period, Qui-Gon's awareness of the Shadow Hand's overarching strategy sharpened. Sith-aligned adversaries were not merely testing capabilities, they sought to induce ethical compromise, exploiting gaps in judgment to undermine Jedi influence. Qui-Gon countered with rigorous self-assessment, mental discipline, and strategic mentoring for all operatives under his guidance. Jedi training evolved to include subtle detection of moral manipulation, resilience against deception, and strategies for long-term influence without violating ethical codes. The objective was clear: neutralize threat while preserving moral authority, demonstrating that power and principle could coexist even under extreme duress. Qui-Gon's own philosophy deepened as well. The survival that had altered history was not simply a second chance at life. It was an opportunity to explore the intersections of ethics, influence, and systemic stability on an unprecedented scale. Through countless engagements, he learned to balance immediate tactical needs against long-term strategic impact. Each intervention required an evaluation not only of outcomes, but also of moral precedent. The galaxy responded dynamically. Systems shifted, alliances evolved, and Sith strategies adapted in response to Jedi innovations. Qui-Gon recognized that survival alone was not sufficient. The true challenge was responsible stewardship of influence, the careful modulation of power across a web of interdependent systems. Meanwhile, Anakin's development continued apace. His unique connection to the Force, once prone to impulsive surges, was now guided through a combination of mentorship, scenario-driven exposure, and reflective exercises designed to cultivate moral clarity alongside skill mastery. Qui-Gon emphasized that strength alone could not dictate destiny. Foresight, ethical consideration, and restraint were equally critical. Anakin's innate confidence and exceptional aptitude were channeled into strategic insight, laying a foundation that would profoundly impact the Clone Wars and beyond. In this timeline, the young Jedi's path diverged from the one marred by tragedy, shaping a galaxy where choice, guidance, and awareness held sway over destiny's cruel arbitrariness. As the section drew to a close, Qui-Gon's influence had begun to manifest across multiple layers of galactic life. Political systems were subtly realigned, trade networks stabilized, and insurgent activity contained through a combination of Jedi foresight and ethical intervention. Sith-aligned adversaries, frustrated by repeated subversion of their schemes, intensified surveillance and experimentation. Yet Qui-Gon's interventions had set a precedent. Power was effective not through domination, but through guided influence, moral clarity, and strategic foresight. The galaxy was, for the first time in decades, subtly aligned with stability, not through fear or coercion, but through invisible currents of reason, ethics, and disciplined action. Qui-Gon stood on a balcony overlooking Coruscant's central spire, the neon glow of 1,000 star systems reflecting in his eyes. He sensed the delicate balance in the Force, the subtle interplay between light and darkness, influence and free will. Survival had been the catalyst, but it was his choices, philosophy, and unyielding adherence to principle that were reshaping the galaxy in ways previously unimagined. The Shadow Hand would continue to test, probe, and challenge. Yet Qui-Gon understood the enduring truth. Mastery was not measured by victory alone, but by the ability to guide, influence, and preserve without surrendering moral clarity. In this moment, he understood the essence of his survival. The galaxy was unpredictable, yet within its chaos, guided foresight could create a path toward enduring balance. The Force itself seemed to pulse with affirmation, acknowledging that a single life, preserved against impossible odds, could rewrite destinies, shape civilizations, and redefine the moral fabric of an entire galaxy. The ripples of Qui-Gon Jinn's survival now reached beyond the Republic's core worlds and the Outer Rim's troubled systems. News of his interventions spread quietly at first, subtle reports of Jedi activity where none had been expected, crises averted with uncanny precision, insurgent plots foiled before they escalated. Qui-Gon understood that influence at a distance required more than the presence of a lightsaber or the exercise of the Force. It demanded networks, foresight, and a deft touch on the complex machinery of galactic systems. Intelligence became his ally, and he began constructing a lattice of informed operatives who could act decisively without undermining local autonomy. The galaxy was vast, and no one individual, not even a Jedi of exceptional power, could intervene everywhere. Qui-Gon's genius lay in orchestrating outcomes without revealing the hand guiding them. His attention turned to the mid-rim, where tensions simmered among planetary systems that were nominally loyal to the Republic, but harbored deep resentment over taxation, resource distribution, and perceived neglect. Qui-Gon had long recognized the fragility of loyalty built on convenience rather than shared purpose. Using his connections with sympathetic senators, Jedi operatives, and even discreet merchant houses, he orchestrated a series of diplomatic interventions, subtly adjusting trade agreements, redistributing resources to key systems, and addressing grievances before they metastasized into full-scale rebellion. Unlike traditional Jedi intervention, which often relied on visible displays of power or mediation, Qui-Gon's methods emphasized persuasion, moral clarity, and strategic foresight. Every choice was designed to achieve stability without coercion, a delicate balance that few could manage successfully. Yet even as stability spread, the Shadow Hand, the covert Sith-aligned network, intensified its efforts. Qui-Gon detected patterns of manipulation that suggested not mere opportunism, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of corruption, subterfuge, and influence warfare. Sith agents were not simply striking militarily. They were reshaping perception, spreading misinformation, and subtly corrupting local governments. Qui-Gon countered with multi-layered strategies. Small, precise interventions by Jedi operatives in key areas, indirect influence over local leadership, and discreet guidance to communities at risk. Every action reinforced autonomy rather than dependence, leaving systems resilient to both immediate threats and long-term manipulation. The Shadow Hand quickly realized that conventional tactics, bribery, assassination, intimidation, were insufficient. Qui-Gon's interventions were too subtle to directly detect, yet too consequential to ignore. One particularly challenging engagement occurred on Ratatak, a volatile mining planet whose orbital conflicts and labor disputes had made it a magnet for mercenary groups and crime syndicates. Qui-Gon arrived under the guise of a neutral mediator, accompanied by a small contingent of Jedi and local security forces. His initial task was observation, studying the motivations, alliances, and vulnerabilities of key actors without triggering defensive reactions. The Force guided him toward insights into latent power structures, alliances held together by fear, loyalties forged in secrecy, and subtle cues indicating which factions might be susceptible to influence. By combining Force-guided perception with careful diplomatic engagement, Qui-Gon orchestrated a resolution that satisfied multiple parties. Miners were granted protections, mercenaries redirected toward legitimate contracts, and criminal networks weakened without unnecessary bloodshed. The operation became a model for intervention across similarly unstable systems. Amid these political and strategic efforts, Qui-Gon's mentorship of Anakin Skywalker intensified. The boy's innate potential continued to grow, yet the complexity of the galaxy now required a sophistication of thought beyond combat or raw power. Qui-Gon subjected Anakin to intricate moral and tactical simulations, scenarios that mirrored real galactic dilemmas rather than contrived exercises. Anakin encountered situations in which short-term gains conflicted with long-term stability, where the apparent right choice could carry unforeseen consequences. Qui-Gon emphasized the necessity of considering the ripple effects of action, cultivating a perspective in which foresight, ethical reasoning, and adaptability were as critical as mastery of the Force or mechanical skill. These lessons were difficult for Anakin, whose natural impatience and ambition often clashed with a slow unfolding of strategic outcomes. Yet over time, he internalized the principle that influence without moral guidance was ultimately dangerous. The broader galactic impact of Qui-Gon's survival became increasingly apparent. In the Senate, reform-minded legislators began to find new leverage. Systems long ignored by Republic governance were now stabilized, trade flows normalized, and insurgencies curtailed. Qui-Gon's subtle interventions had created a network of goodwill and competence that functioned independently of his direct presence. Even those skeptical of Jedi influence could not ignore the tangible improvements in security, economy, and societal cohesion. Meanwhile, Sith-aligned actors recalibrated their strategies. The Shadow Hands leaders, frustrated by repeated failures, sought more aggressive measures. Infiltration of high-ranking senators, deployment of dark side agents to critical nodes, and experimental manipulation of Force-sensitive operatives. Qui-Gon anticipated these moves, creating countermeasures that neutralized threats before they could materialize. His foresight became a tool for shaping events on a scale previously unimaginable for a single Jedi. Amid these high-stakes engagements, Qui-Gon faced profound philosophical challenges. The Force had always been a guide, a lens through which to perceive potentialities and discern appropriate action. Yet survival had altered his perception. He now bore the knowledge that interventions, even well-intentioned ones, carried ethical consequences beyond immediate understanding. Each planetary engagement, each negotiation, required careful deliberation. When to intervene, how much influence to exert, and when restraint was necessary. Qui-Gon's survival forced him to reconcile the tension between action and observation, power and responsibility. The galaxy was an intricate web of interdependence, and even the most precise interventions could propagate unforeseen consequences. The Jedi Code, once a set of guiding principles, now served as both compass and caution. Qui-Gon's mastery of indirect influence extended to the Shadow Hands networks themselves. By studying patterns of communication, alliances, and dark side manipulation, he identified opportunities to exploit overconfidence and miscalculation. In one striking instance, he orchestrated a sequence of events in which rival Sith agents inadvertently undermined each other's operations, leaving their schemes exposed to Jedi intervention without a single overt confrontation. These maneuvers were as much psychological as strategic, manipulating perception, exploiting greed and ambition, and creating moral dilemmas that weakened cohesion within enemy ranks. Through careful orchestration, Qui-Gon transformed potential conflict into opportunities for stabilization, demonstrating that the Force could be applied not only in battle, but in the subtle shaping of events. Anakin's growth under these circumstances accelerated dramatically. He began to perceive patterns in politics, diplomacy, and insurgency that were invisible to most Jedi of his rank. Qui-Gon encouraged the boy to take calculated risks, to act decisively in moments where moral clarity aligned with strategic opportunity. Anakin's mastery of the Force, combined with his emerging understanding of influence, made him an unparalleled operative, a young Jedi capable of shaping outcomes across multiple star systems while remaining true to core ethical principles. Qui-Gon recognized that Anakin's development, nurtured in this unique timeline, created possibilities that extended far beyond immediate intervention. Together, master and apprentice had begun to construct a galaxy resilient not only to aggression, but also to corruption and short-sightedness. Yet the Shadow Hand remained persistent. Across multiple sectors, their covert operations intensified, testing the limits of Qui-Gon's foresight and Anakin's adaptability. Sith-aligned infiltrators sought to destabilize systems by exploiting factional rivalries, manipulating trade dependencies, and fostering ideological discord. Qui-Gon countered by anticipating these moves through a combination of Force-guided insight and careful intelligence analysis. Jedi operatives executed precise interventions, while local leaders, empowered by Qui-Gon's guidance, implemented policies that preempted destabilization. In each engagement, the Jedi maintained moral authority, ensuring that outcomes aligned with ethical imperatives rather than mere expediency. The Shadow Hand's attempts to manipulate perception ultimately strengthened the Republic's resilience, as citizens and leaders alike adapted to challenges with enhanced awareness and cooperation. In the Outer Rim, Qui-Gon's influence began to shape the course of military and civic planning. Systems that had previously relied on mercenary forces or local militias now adopted more structured governance, integrating ethical oversight, resource management, and strategic foresight. Jedi mentorship extended beyond Anakin, with trained operatives acting as guides for local leadership, ensuring that long-term stability could endure even without direct intervention. Qui-Gon emphasized that true influence required empowerment, not control. The galaxy's balance, once fragile and reactive, began to demonstrate emergent stability, a testament to the careful calibration of ethics, foresight, and strategic action. The philosophical resonance of Qui-Gon's survival reached its zenith as he contemplated the cumulative effect of these interventions. The galaxy was no longer merely a battleground of light and dark, Republic and Sith, rebellion and tyranny. It had become a dynamic system in which the interplay of influence, foresight, and ethical guidance could shape outcomes without coercion. Qui-Gon recognized that the Force was not merely a tool for battle. It was a medium through which understanding, insight, and moral clarity could ripple outward, stabilizing societies and preventing crises before they escalated. His survival had enabled a recalibration of what was possible within the Force, a demonstration that foresight, subtle guidance, and principled action could create enduring change on an unprecedented scale. In these moments of reflection, Qui-Gon stood once again on the observation balcony above Coruscant, overlooking the glittering city world, the pulse of the galaxy reflected in the lights below. He sensed the interplay of forces, political, economic, and social, that responded to his interventions with subtlety and unpredictability. The Shadow Hand continued its machinations, but their failures reinforced a new paradigm, one in which Jedi foresight, ethical guidance, and strategic influence could stabilize entire sectors without resorting to domination. The galaxy, resilient and aware, had begun to adapt to principles of balance, foresight, and moral clarity in ways previously unimaginable. Qui-Gon Jinn's survival had not merely altered events. It had redefined the operational philosophy of the Jedi, creating a legacy that extended far beyond any single conflict or engagement. The galaxy had reached a tipping point. Qui-Gon Jinn's survival had already reshaped countless systems, from mid-rim trade networks to the outer rim colonies. And yet even he recognized that the greatest test lay ahead, the confrontation with a core threat whose existence had long shadowed the Republic, the Sith. Not merely the visible agents, manipulators, and spies, but the hidden architects of chaos, the dark philosophies that sought to bend the galaxy to their will. Qui-Gon's strategy had always emphasized prevention, subtle intervention, and moral persuasion. But now the universe demanded a decisive engagement that could determine the trajectory of entire eras. Qui-Gon sensed a convergence unlike anything he had ever felt. A disturbance in the Force so profound it suggested that the Shadow Hand had consolidated forces in ways previously unseen. Sith apprentices, rogue inquisitors, and covert agents had orchestrated a coordinated offensive against strategic Republic systems, exploiting vulnerabilities in both local governance and planetary defenses. This network was no longer a scattered nuisance. It was a coordinated entity capable of sustained conflict. Qui-Gon's survival and influence had delayed their plans, but the threat had evolved into something more formidable than mere sabotage. It was a galaxy-scale test of both his foresight and his moral judgment. Accompanying Qui-Gon, Anakin Skywalker had matured into a Jedi whose capabilities now rivaled experienced masters. The boy, no longer just a prodigy, was a strategist, a diplomat, and a warrior, capable of assessing political and tactical situations with insight uncommon for his age. Qui-Gon recognized that the upcoming confrontation would demand not only physical combat prowess, but a synthesis of foresight, moral clarity, and adaptability. The battle would be as much about influencing outcomes, preempting decisions, and guiding allies as it would be about lightsabers and force powers. The first major encounter unfolded on the planet Raxus Prime, where the Shadow Hand had embedded a network of Sith-aligned mercenaries, dark acolytes, and corrupted planetary administrators. Qui-Gon approached under the guise of a diplomatic envoy, yet he and Anakin were acutely aware that the situation would almost certainly devolve into direct confrontation. Utilizing a combination of stealth, force-guided insight, and pre-placed operatives, Qui-Gon coordinated a multi-pronged approach. One team neutralized communications and supply lines. Another redirected planetary militia forces toward key objectives. A third, operating under the radar, worked to convince local leaders that continued subservience to Sith operatives would result in systemic collapse. The interplay of these strategies illustrated Qui-Gon's mastery of indirect intervention, combating the dark threat not merely with raw power, but through influence, intelligence, and moral leverage. Despite these meticulous preparations, the Sith's strategic brilliance became evident immediately. The Shadow Hand had anticipated certain movements, feigned weaknesses, and baited Jedi operatives into traps. Qui-Gon's foresight, while profound, could not account for every contingency. Anakin found himself confronted with Sith apprentices wielding force powers that challenged even his growing skill, requiring him to improvise maneuvers and strategies in real time. Qui-Gon, fully aware of the stakes, intervened with subtle but decisive precision, redirecting enemy attacks, amplifying allies' confidence through force-enhanced morale, and exploiting small openings that could turn the tide without unnecessary destruction. In every instance, their success depended not on brute force alone, but on the careful orchestration of multiple variables: psychology, perception, terrain, and timing. The moral dimension of the engagement emerged as a core challenge. Qui-Gon recognized that victory could be achieved in multiple ways: through annihilation of the enemy, capture and reform, or strategic manipulation that forced them to dismantle themselves from within. The Sith, however, were ideologically inflexible, willing to sacrifice entire planetary populations for personal or philosophical gain. Qui-Gon faced the ethical dilemma of how far he could intervene without betraying the Jedi principles he upheld. Direct confrontation risked massive casualties. Subtle manipulation, while less destructive, required patience and the careful exploitation of enemies' flaws. The stakes could not be measured merely in tactical outcomes. They were questions of morality, governance, and the long-term stability of countless systems. Anakin, guided by Qui-Gon, learned the complexity of this moral calculus firsthand. In one critical moment, he faced a Sith operative holding hostages in a planetary Senate building. Anakin's natural instinct, fueled by righteous anger, was to strike decisively and eliminate the threat. Qui-Gon intervened, using the Force to subtly influence the minds of guards and enemy combatants, creating openings for extraction without lethal confrontation. This exercise demonstrated a broader lesson. True mastery of the Force and true influence in the galaxy was not measured by how many enemies one could defeat, but by how effectively one could shape outcomes while preserving life and order. The boy's understanding of restraint, ethical influence, and calculated risk would define his development and foreshadow his ultimate potential to act as a stabilizing force in the galaxy. Meanwhile, Qui-Gon's interventions created a series of cascading effects throughout the sector. Neutral systems, observing the Jedi's successful handling of the crisis without excessive violence, gained confidence in their ability to resist Sith manipulation. Merchant guilds, previously exploited for profit by dark operatives, restructured operations to prevent infiltration. Local militias, inspired by the Jedi's restraint and strategic acumen, became self-organizing and effective defensive forces. The Shadow Hand found itself increasingly isolated, unable to exert influence in areas where Qui-Gon's guidance had already fostered resilience. Every engagement reinforced a philosophy of principled influence, a demonstration that strategic foresight, ethical action, and the Force could reshape not only immediate outcomes, but the structural integrity of entire systems. The confrontation reached its climax on Raxus Prime, when Qui-Gon and Anakin finally faced the Shadow Hand's regional commander, a dark acolyte who had cultivated both political influence and Force mastery. The battle was not merely a duel of lightsabers or Force powers. It was a contest of perception, insight, and moral authority. Qui-Gon leveraged his knowledge of the Force, combined with his understanding of the commander's ambitions and fears, to manipulate the engagement's dynamics. He created illusions of vulnerability, drawing the enemy into overcommitment, while simultaneously guiding Anakin to exploit gaps in strategy. The resulting confrontation was decisive. The commander was neutralized, their network fractured, and the integrity of surrounding planetary systems preserved. Yet the victory was not total annihilation. Qui-Gon ensured that surviving adversaries had the opportunity to reassess their allegiances, demonstrating the capacity for redemption even among those steeped in darkness. The outcome of this confrontation had ripple effects. Galaxy. The Shadow Hand, weakened and exposed, could no longer operate with the same impunity. Systems that had been on the brink of rebellion or subjugation stabilized, trade routes reopened, and the Republic's cohesion strengthened. Qui-Gon's influence had extended beyond the immediate tactical victories to create a resilient framework in which systems could govern themselves effectively, while remaining insulated from both overt and covert threats. The Jedi, observing these outcomes, began to re-evaluate their methods, inspired by Qui-Gon's integration of foresight, ethical intervention, and strategic acumen. The confrontation also had profound implications for Anakin Skywalker. Experiencing the complexity of decision-making under extreme pressure and witnessing Qui-Gon's philosophy of principled influence in action, he internalized lessons that would shape his understanding of power, responsibility, and morality. The boy's maturation was no longer hypothetical. It was a lived experience of shaping outcomes while maintaining ethical integrity. Qui-Gon recognized that this development, nurtured in a universe without his early death, had the potential to prevent the catastrophic errors that would otherwise define Anakin's trajectory. The implications extended far beyond the immediate battle. They suggested a future in which Anakin could fulfill his potential as a stabilizing force, rather than a harbinger of galactic conflict. In reflecting upon the confrontation, Qui-Gon understood that the galaxy's path had been irrevocably altered. The Republic, strengthened by proactive interventions, resilient systems, and informed leadership, had a newfound capacity to resist both overt aggression and covert manipulation. The Sith, fragmented and exposed, were forced into recalibration, unable to dominate or destabilize the galaxy as easily as before. And Anakin, mentored in both skill and wisdom, represented the emergence of a new generation of Jedi capable of navigating complex political, ethical, and tactical landscapes. Qui-Gon's survival, once merely a divergence from destiny, had now shaped outcomes on a galactic scale, creating a trajectory the galaxy had never anticipated. Even as the dust settled, Qui-Gon remained vigilant. The Force whispered of continuing disturbances, of subtle manipulations yet unrecognized, and of the long-term consequences of decisions made under duress. He understood that no single engagement could eliminate all threats, and that the moral and strategic responsibility of guiding systems and individuals remained ongoing. Yet for the first time, Qui-Gon recognized that the principles he had long advocated, ethical influence, foresight, and restraint, were not merely theoretical ideals, but practical tools capable of reshaping history. The galaxy's future, while still uncertain, now contained the possibility of stability, justice, and balance in ways previously unimaginable. The climax on Raxus Prime, therefore, represented more than a tactical victory. It symbolized the emergence of a new operational philosophy for the Jedi, a paradigm in which foresight, ethical guidance, and strategic intelligence could shape outcomes across multiple systems without resorting to domination or fear. Qui-Gon Jinn, alive and fully aware of his potential, had transformed the galaxy not merely by surviving, but by acting with clarity, restraint, and moral authority. The consequences of his survival would resonate across eras, influencing political, social, and ethical trajectories, and creating a galaxy more resilient to both overt and subtle threats. The aftermath of Raxus Prime's confrontation marked a turning point not only for the Shadow Hand, but for the entire galaxy. Systems across the Mid-Rim, Outer Rim, and Core worlds had begun to recalibrate their political and strategic priorities, responding to the demonstration that a Jedi could intervene decisively without sacrificing ethics or stability. Qui-Gon Jinn understood that the fight was never purely about defeating enemies. It was about shaping the galaxy's structures in a way that allowed prosperity, security, and moral integrity to coexist. Yet even as the dust settled, he knew that the final reckoning was still ahead. The Sith, though fragmented, had not disappeared. Their influence persisted in hidden corners, waiting for opportunity. Qui-Gon convened a council of trusted allies on the neutral world of Ossus, a planet long revered as a repository of Jedi knowledge and history. Representatives from multiple systems attended, including senators from the Republic, planetary governors, and independent leaders who had earned Qui-Gon's trust during the crisis. Among them was Anakin Skywalker, now fully aware of the breadth of responsibility his role entailed. Qui-Gon's survival had allowed him to mentor Anakin in ways previously impossible, and the boy's insights, tempered with experience and ethical grounding, became integral to the strategy for stabilizing the galaxy. This assembly was not merely ceremonial. It was the beginning of a proactive governance model in which Jedi influence complemented political, social, and economic structures without supplanting them. During the council sessions, Qui-Gon addressed the lingering Sith threat. He emphasized that elimination of key operatives was insufficient. The ideology underpinning their actions, corruption, domination, and exploitation of fear, remained deeply ingrained. Solutions required systemic interventions, education, reinforcement of local governance, and subtle deterrence against manipulation. Jedi resources were allocated not just for military engagement, but for intelligence networks, mediation teams, and Force-guided advisory roles. Qui-Gon's philosophy had always been that the Force could guide outcomes without coercion, and now the Republic had an opportunity to implement that philosophy on a galactic scale. The interplay of moral clarity and strategic foresight became the cornerstone of this new paradigm. Meanwhile, Anakin Skywalker's trajectory diverged dramatically from the path known to history. Under Qui-Gon's mentorship, he developed a sense of ethical responsibility that tempered his impetuous nature. He was taught not only to wield the Force with skill, but to weigh every action against long-term consequences for systems, populations, and individuals. During one field operation on the industrial planet of Ryloth, Anakin confronted a remnant Sith faction attempting to enslave local populations for labor in secret mining operations. Unlike the impassioned strikes that might have characterized his early responses, Anakin orchestrated a multi-layered approach, redirecting Imperial supply lines, empowering local militias with strategic intelligence, and manipulating enemy perceptions through Force-guided influence. The outcome was decisive, efficient, and moral, demonstrating that Jedi strength could manifest not only in combat, but in foresight-driven action that preserved life and dignity. The Sith, however, were not idle. Across distant sectors, operatives plotted countermeasures, leveraging the galaxy's fractured political landscape and exploiting tensions among neutral systems. Qui-Gon anticipated these maneuvers, applying subtle preemptive measures that ensured local leadership remained resilient. One notable example occurred on the Outer Rim world of Dathomir, where a coalition of dark acolytes sought to establish a foothold. Qui-Gon, guided by the Force, used a combination of tactical diversion and moral persuasion to redirect the acolytes' focus, ultimately facilitating the defection of key operatives who had grown disillusioned with the dark philosophy. This approach, blending strategy with ethical influence, exemplified Qui-Gon's ability to operate at peak capacity while remaining true to Jedi principles, a stark contrast to the reactive, militarized approaches that had historically dominated conflict resolution. At the galactic level, Qui-Gon's actions initiated a ripple effect that transformed political and cultural landscapes. The Republic, historically rigid and bureaucratic, began adopting more responsive and adaptive governance models. Planetary systems, having witnessed the efficacy of Jedi-guided but morally conscious intervention, developed confidence in self-governance while relying on Jedi advisory networks for complex crises. Even neutral worlds, previously wary of Jedi influence, recognized the value of an approach that balanced strategic insight with ethical restraint. The galaxy's trajectory shifted not through domination or fear, but through proactive, enlightened intervention that strengthened societal resilience and deterred the resurgence of malevolent forces. The climax of this broader conflict, however, required a confrontation with the Sith's core architects, figures long hidden in shadow, manipulating events from distant worlds and secretive enclaves. Qui-Gon recognized that these individuals were not merely obstacles to be defeated, but challenges that tested the very principles guiding his interventions. He and Anakin led a meticulously planned mission to Malachor V, a planet steeped in dark history and rich with residual dark side energy. The terrain itself was perilous. Ruined temples, unstable energy fields, and remnants of ancient conflicts created both environmental hazards and opportunities for strategic advantage. Qui-Gon's mastery of the Force allowed him to anticipate natural and metaphysical dangers, guiding Anakin and allied forces through the treacherous landscape while preserving their operational integrity. The confrontation with the Sith core was as much psychological as it was physical. Qui-Gon and Anakin faced adversaries whose understanding of the dark side allowed them to anticipate traditional Force techniques and lightsaber maneuvers. Victory demanded improvisation, moral clarity, and strategic creativity. Qui-Gon utilized the Force to create dynamic illusions, manipulate battlefield perception, and exploit psychological vulnerabilities among the enemy. Simultaneously, Anakin applied lessons in restraint, timing, and ethical intervention to subvert the Sith's expectations. The battle unfolded as a symphony of tactics, ethical reasoning, and Force-guided influence, culminating in the decisive neutralization of the Sith leadership without unnecessary annihilation of life or planetary resources. Following this climax, the galaxy experienced a profound period of stabilization. Qui-Gon's survival had prevented numerous crises, reshaped political and ethical paradigms, and cultivated a generation of Jedi, including Anakin, capable of balancing power with moral responsibility. Systems previously vulnerable to manipulation had become resilient. Factions had been guided toward constructive, cooperative frameworks, and the Sith, fragmented and exposed, were unable to recover sufficient influence to threaten galactic order. Qui-Gon's approach demonstrated that intervention, when guided by ethical foresight and a commitment to preserving life, could produce outcomes far more sustainable than reactive military campaigns or authoritarian control. Qui-Gon and Anakin, standing on the restored citadel of Ossus, reflected on the long-term implications of their actions. The Force, ever present and guiding, had revealed that destiny was not immutable, but could be shaped by wisdom, ethical action, and strategic foresight. Qui-Gon understood that this era represented a pivotal divergence from known history, a timeline in which Jedi influence, moral clarity, and principled intervention prevented widespread corruption, minimized systemic failures, and enabled the emergence of resilient leadership across galactic sectors. Anakin, having internalized these lessons, embodied the potential for a Jedi who could navigate the complexities of morality, strategy, and leadership without succumbing to impulsive or destructive tendencies. Yet Qui-Gon's awareness extended beyond immediate outcomes. He recognized that the Force, while powerful, was not a guarantor of permanent stability. Future challenges would arise, new ideologies would emerge, and the delicate balance between light and dark would remain an ongoing responsibility for those attuned to its currents. The legacy of his survival was not merely the prevention of specific crises, but the establishment of principles, strategies, and ethical frameworks that could guide generations of Jedi and galactic leaders. His vision, realized through careful mentorship, strategic intervention, and ethical steadfastness, had altered the galaxy in ways that would resonate across centuries. In the final analysis, The galaxy's new trajectory exemplified the profound consequences of Qui-Gon Jinn's survival. The Sith had been weakened, but not entirely extinguished. Political structures had been reinforced and made more adaptable. Individuals across the galaxy, both leaders and ordinary citizens, had learned that moral action coupled with strategic insight could produce durable stability. Anakin, now both a warrior and a philosopher in training, represented the culmination of this new paradigm. A force sensitive capable of integrating power, ethics, and foresight into a cohesive vision for the galaxy's future. Qui-Gon's life, once tragically cut short, had become a fulcrum upon which entire systems, philosophies, and destinies balanced. As the sun set over Ossus, bathing the restored temples and training halls in golden light, Qui-Gon Jinn and Anakin Skywalker stood in silent reflection. The galaxy, though far from perfect, had glimpsed a path where wisdom, courage, and ethical clarity could redefine outcomes. Qui-Gon's survival had prevented catastrophe, nurtured potential, and illustrated that intervention guided by principle could achieve results that raw power alone could never deliver. The Jedi Order, the Republic, and even previously neutral systems now possessed the tools to confront the future with resilience, insight, and moral confidence. For Qui-Gon, the journey was far from complete. New threats would emerge, challenges would demand both skill and ethical discernment, and the subtle currents of the Force would continue to reveal unforeseen dangers. Yet for the first time in galactic memory, a Jedi had acted not merely as a soldier or enforcer, but as a guiding conscience, one whose survival had forever altered the course of history, and whose legacy promised that the galaxy, while imperfect, could pursue balance, justice, and enduring peace. Qui-Gon Jinn's survival reshaped the galaxy in ways no one could have predicted. By avoiding his premature death, he preserved the continuity of wisdom, mentorship, and ethical foresight that fundamentally altered both political and force-sensitive dynamics across star systems. The Republic became more resilient, planetary systems learned to defend themselves intelligently, and Anakin Skywalker matured under guidance that tempered his impetuosity with moral and strategic acumen. Wars were fought with precision and principle rather than sheer aggression, and even the Sith, though persistent, were forced into recalibration, unable to manipulate events with the same efficiency as before. The galaxy had glimpsed a new model of intervention, one where foresight, restraint, and ethical action could prevent crises without imposing tyranny or fear. Qui-Gon's legacy became a blueprint for Jedi influence, a demonstration that the Force could shape history not through domination, but through wisdom and moral clarity. Systems, leaders, and citizens alike internalized lessons of responsibility, resilience, and strategic cooperation. The consequences of his survival would reverberate for generations, creating a galaxy more prepared, more just, and more capable of resisting darkness in all its forms. Qui-Gon Jinn had proven that one life, guided by principle and vision, could alter destinies across the stars. His choices and those of his apprentice ensured that the galaxy's story would be written not solely by war, but by wisdom.